Well, thank you very much, Andre. Good morning. I'm going to speak to you for the next half hour on errors. But before doing that, I'll have to get my presentation up here. It's the first big challenge. It's not coming. Can I activate that? There we go. Excellent. Thank you very much. So I'm going to speak to you for the next 30 minutes about errors and how they may affect your industry. I'm mostly concerned in talking to managers, and this is not going to work. Oh yeah, here we go. And the first thing that may come to your mind is when you heard what Andre is saying, that my research is about airline crews and pilots in particular. Where's the connection between management on the one side, software development in your area, and flight crews? Well, you may have heard about this little project here, which is supposed to be Berlin's new airport. Conveniently, we still have the old airport in place, so you could argue we don't need the new one. But originally it was projected shortly after reunification as a new big airport for Berlin, unifying the three separate airports that we had until the early 1990s. The project was supposed to be completed in June 2012. It's still not finished, and it probably will not for another 2 to 3 years. What went wrong? You could argue that the German engineers are not really very well. That could be one explanation, but it could also be that communication within the project was not running very well. And this is probably more the case, as even our mayor, Klaus Wowereit, mentioned at one point. And this is something that was also observed in the aviation community, that sometimes you have crashes of airplanes because communication is becoming an issue. Information is available, but it's not transferred within the people who are supposed to deal with that information. Before getting into the subject, I don't know, is anybody frightened in getting into an airplane? Well, you're all technically, so probably less fear than we have in some other audiences. Well, I'd like to give you a brief statistic, and just to show you that aviation actually is not an area for concern. There's one area where you should be a little bit more concerned about safety. That's medicine and hospitals. If you look at failure rates in hospitals, and this is a statistic that was done from the German insurance corporation, that they said we have about 17 million patients going through hospital each year, and there is an estimate that in about 0.1% of the cases we have a fatal error from a doctor, which would translate into about 17,000 deaths by medical error, which is, if you just look at the number, a rather frightening number. The question is, why is there no public outcry? Well, if you translate it to the individual hospital, we have 2,000 hospitals in Germany, that's about less than one death patient due to medical error per hospital per month. So not really a figure that should give you some fear, unless you are the one who is affected. If you compare that to the safety record of Lufthansa, and only Lufthansa alone, if you would have a failure rate in Lufthansa for their 1 million flights that they carry out each year, that would translate into 1,000 accidents per year, and there would be more than 2 fatal accidents a day. Certainly something that would not go unnoticed in the public sphere, and that's one of the reasons why aviation, because of the high-profile events that crashes causes, there's much more concern about safety than in other places that we have. Well, then the question is, what is it actually? What is the connection between errors and safety, and what actually is safe, and how are errors connected to that? There's one statistic from the military comparing error rates of different units. And the question is, which unit is the safest? If you look at the error rates, you have 21.7 per thousand work days in one unit and 5.2. Can we tell? No, we can't, because this is only what is reported. We don't know which is the safest. What we know in the statistic is the survey, the units are not actually classified or ranked by the error rates, but actually by the climate in which they are encouraged to report errors. And all we know is that Unit 1 obviously has a better climate and therefore also get more reports. Are they safer? Well, maybe, because they have more opportunities for learning, but we don't know. In this case, actually, it was the Israeli Air Force who introduced that error reporting system, and it had a tremendous effect, but I'll come to that later on, why this was the case. Let's turn to a big case in aviation history that was a turning point after which they have a very different approach to errors than before. This was a case that happened in 1978. It was a crew that was flying from Denver to Portland, Oregon. On the controls was one of the most experienced captains of United Airlines. He had 28,000 hours of flight time under his belt. A very experienced co-pilot, a very experienced flight engineer, and an additional captain in the cockpit. So from the outset, everything seemed to be all right and in their favor. They were already flying as a crew for some time, so they had been well accustomed to each other. When they were on the approach to Portland, they were confronted with a minor problem. The main gear would not extend as planned. So they had an indication that part of the gear was not getting down. What are pilots doing when they are confronted with an emergency? Well, they have procedures. They go through checklists, they work them methodically, and they did it for about half an hour. Everything worked pretty well. They were very calm, very collected. They were talking to the cabin attendants, they were preparing the crew, and so on. However, after about half an hour into that situation, the first officer became a little bit concerned about the fuel situation because he was realizing they were getting low on fuel. So what would you think the first officer would do? Any idea? Panic might be an option, but they're pilots, so they're very calm. Any other idea? Talk to the others. What would he say? Okay, that would be, if he would have said that, they wouldn't have a problem. He'd choose another direction. Actually, he turned to his flight engineer and asked him, Frosty, so they were on first names, Frosty, what is the fuel showing? And the flight engineer gave the information that he was asked for, 5,000 pounds of fuel. So you might think he was just asking for an information, but then he also turned to the captain and said, buddy, captain, what is the fuel figure showing? And the captain said 5,000 pounds of fuel. So if the co-pilot was concerned about the fuel situation, he basically made sure everybody in the cockpit knew fuel level was 5,000 pounds, but not more. That was all he asked for, and that was all the others confirmed. The problem started about 2 or 3 minutes later when the captain was turning to the flight engineer and was asking for the landing weight, which is a usual thing for a pilot to ask for because he needs to set the approach speed accordingly. The question of the captain was a little bit more complicated than the first one. He was asking the flight engineer, what's the landing weight in 15 minutes with 3,000 or 4,000 pounds of fuel. The problem is the DC-8 consumes about 250 pounds of fuel a minute. So if you do the math, knowing you start with 5,000 pounds of fuel, you add another 15 minutes, you come to the conclusion this figure will not add up. He will never have 3,000 to 5,000 pounds of fuel in 15 minutes for the landing. Why is he asking for the reserve? Well, he'd like to make sure he's not landing with empty tanks, but the figure doesn't work. What is the flight engineer doing? Well, he's sort of mumbling, but he's not really saying this is not going to work, and he provides a number to the captain. So what is the figure from the captain now? He thinks he has plenty of fuel. Co-pilot and flight engineer are concerned. Do they say anything? No, they don't. The only thing that you have for the next 10 minutes is the co-pilot asking again the same question. How much fuel do we have? A much better option would have been to say, we don't have enough fuel, get it on the ground. The question is, why aren't they talking with each other in a more direct way? And well, in the end, the engines flamed out. The plane crash landed, and 10 people died, did not survive. And the flight engineer who was sitting in the cockpit, who was talking about the fuel figure, he also died in this crash. And this is, if you think about it, a very disturbing fact, because 3 crew members, 2 of them knew they were becoming fuel critical, they're not having enough fuel, and they don't speak openly to the captain about the situation, even if it affects them. And this is something that caused a lot of concern for the aviation authorities after that, because they realized, well, maybe this is not only a freak event, but actually part of a major trend that we see in cockpits. We rely very much on automation. That was until that time. Planes become safer and safer because more technology became more reliable. But in the end, planes were coming down because poor crew interaction. So what could they do? Well, first of all, they looked at numbers, and what they already knew was human factor was the major cause for crashes of airplanes. You might argue, well, that's because human and systems don't interact very well, and sometimes people just get overwhelmed, and that's the reason. So it's sometimes more the technology that's the problem. But overall, this is actually a rather frightening number if you look at it. What was more interesting was when they looked at the number of cases where the captain was at the control versus and the plane crashed versus the situation where the co-pilot was at the control and the plane crashed. You should know that captain and co-pilot, or first officer, fly rather on an equal basis. So each of them flies half the time. One like the captain, the other like the co-pilot. Always that kind of structure. There are only a few airports where it's mandatory that the captain lands, and there are only a few situations where it might be advisable that the more experienced pilot, the captain, should do the landing. For example, if you have extreme crosswinds. These situations apart, you come to a distribution of, let's say, 49% flight time of the co-pilot, 51% of the captain. That should be the distribution. In accident situations, we have a very different distribution. And the distribution in this case is we have 80% of the cases the captain was at the controls, which is a bit surprising because the captain is the more experienced of the 2 crew members. And still, he crashes more often than the co-pilot. Well, it's not so surprising if you think about for whom it is easier to correct errors. If you have the co-pilot spotting an error that the captain makes, it's very hard to correct the captain because of his experience level, and you're not sure, is the captain intentionally doing something wrong from the perspective of the co-pilot, or is it because he has different information than the co-pilot, different experience? If the co-pilot is on the wrong track, it's very easy for the captain to interfere. That's his job. He's there to actually supervise the co-pilot and make sure he's getting the experience and survive his learning stage until he becomes the captain himself. So what should they do? Well, first of all, think a little bit about how errors are happening. And sometimes, as I mentioned, it's human error. But you could argue also maybe it's because technology is not always at hand, which is nice for people with technological background. Think about technical solutions. So in this case, with that poor donkey hanging in the air, what might have helped is a little calculator for center of gravity calculation. However, we also see the same kind of mistake happening in a high-tech industry. This plane is, by the way, not taking off. It's sitting firmly on the ground. It's loaded in the same way as the donkey cart, and then sits on its back. Very expensive, but and very avoidable. So not something you would expect. The question is technology really the answer? And there was some nice research done later by James Reason, who said technology is not the answer, and there's some reasons for this. Maybe some of you remember this case. It was happening, I think, in 1988, if I'm not completely mistaken, in Mulhouse, small airport in France. There was an air show, and there was an A320 aircraft, relatively new at that time, and the captain of this airplane wanted to demonstrate its low-speed flying capabilities close to the ground. Very spectacular maneuver, very slow flight. The airplane has a computerized system that basically prevents the airplane from stalling. It will always have enough power to keep it flying, even if it's flying very slowly at a very high angle of attack. In the end, it crashed somewhere here. How can we prevent this kind of crash? Well, the traditional answer is set layers of safety, technical systems, procedures, and whatever, to make sure this cannot happen. And this is what basically the Airbus engineers had in mind. Creating a computerized system that prevents the airplane from getting stalled. Before that, pilots could stall an airplane, would crash, this airplane couldn't stall. Well, if you have this kind of system, you always have to anticipate that systems are never perfectly designable. You always have holes in these systems. You always have things that are not working, interacting with other things as planned. And reason call these latent weaknesses. And like in a Swiss cheese, they're punching the layers. If you now have a trigger, in this case a flight attendant in the cockpit, to whom the captain wanted to demonstrate these low-flying airspeed capabilities, you may end up in a situation where all the holes are lined up perfectly, and you end up in this situation. In this case, there was a forest in the end, and because of the high angle of attack, I mean, the captain was seeing the forest coming up to him, but he expected that the engines would spool up much faster than they eventually did, and he was not able to get the aircraft above this wooded area and crashed inside there. So the answer was, don't rely on technical measures. Don't expect that you will ever be able to prevent errors. You will always be confronted with errors in complex systems. So the shift should be from error prevention to error management. Error management is the real challenge in aviation. Well, sounds easy, but how is it in practice? And what is our experience when we're confronted with errors? It's not that people say, great, you've made an error, let's celebrate it, everything's fine. But it's rather the opposite. We rather are confronted with accuse, blame, criticize, the ABC of error management. The reason for this has to do with how we, where we see the causes of errors. We associate errors with neglect, inattention, laziness, incompetence, sloppy work, stupidity. These are associations that we take from errors. But is this correct? And the other observation, or the other view that you could have, is they could also be associated with uncertainty, complexity, lack of training, fatigue. We may be stressed, workload may be too high. So there may be outside factors who prevent us from giving full performance, who actually lead us into errors. It's a very different perspective. So what should we do? Well, there's some theory. If you spot an error, speak up, address the issue, make it your own concern, and so on. This is the theory. What are we seeing in practice? Well, in many situations, we're in a situation where it's not very comfortable to speak up, because maybe the people we do speak up to are not really share the same concerns that we have. So it might be actually very tough. And then we also have the feeling that, we are never 100% sure in many cases that if we spot an error, it's really an error, because we also might have the wrong observation, especially when we're dealing with very competent, very senior people. We sometimes feel secure, and we don't want to be seen as ignorant, incompetent, intrusive, negative, inconsiderate, or non-compliant. These are attributes we don't like to be associated with. What do we do? Well, it's very easy. We don't ask questions. We don't admit weaknesses. We don't offer ideas. We don't critique the status quo. We're not speaking up openly. And we don't voice concerns. This is typical behavior in organizations. Is it good? No, it's not. But this is the way we've been brought up, and so it's not that easy to change. We did a survey with managers, and we asked them, what is your preference in talking about errors? And interestingly, regardless of whether they were talking to their superiors, so they were spotting an error done by a superior, or if they were spotting an error by one of their employees, they were preferring to talk to the person in a confidential setting, eye-to-eye confidential setting. Don't address an error in the open, which is in a way understandable, as I said, because errors, especially in Germany, are not seen as positive events, but rather as negative events, and you don't want to put other people in a bad light. So you, in a way, try to protect them. What was a little bit surprising was the second question that we asked: how are people addressing your errors? What is your experience when being confronted with errors that you made? And the answer there was a little bit different. Still, we had about half of the respondents saying, yes, if I make an error, I'll get approached in private. But actually, 20%, close to 20% said, I'm getting my feedback in the open. Well, either he has very different superiors and very different employees than all the others are, so they would criticize openly, or the perception is different. And this is rather what I would say. People expect open feedback more often than they actually do get feedback often. If you do surveys in organizations, you see that people do not like to speak up. It's not something that comes lightly. We are not prepared to speak up openly. If you would like to have open talk about errors, have people admit their own weaknesses, but also create an environment where it's easy for them to speak up, you have to create an atmosphere of safety. And it's a concept from a Harvard professor, Amy Edmondson. She developed the concept in the mid-1990s, and it's called psychological safety. If you would like to have people to speak openly, you have to create a safe environment. Again, it sounds very easy, and if you think a little bit further, there's one obvious thing that you should keep in mind. What about accountability? I mean, if it's safe to do errors, how is it with accountability? Because we all like to make errors, but we also know making errors can create a lot of problems. So how do we deal with that? And the question is how to strike a balance within an organization between, on the one side, safety, where it's safe to make errors, and on the other side, to ensure that people still deliver good work and are accountable for their work. Well, you could frame it a little bit different. You could put it on an axis and say you have situations where you have low accountability, high accountability, and low and high psychological safety. If you think about the first quadrant, this obviously is not a very nice one, but it's also not a very damaging one, because you're not accountable. Your safety is low, but your accountability is also low. So you basically just sit there and try to do nothing. The next thing is probably, from an employee's perspective, the nicest one. You're not accountable, but you're psychological safe. So you don't have to fear anything from doing something wrong. However, this is not what most organizations would like to have. They would rather go for high accountability. If you don't have, however, high safety, then it can be very terrifying for employees. So what's the last quadrant here? What kind of organization should that be? And I think this should be the one that we should aim for. It's a running organization. Because in this situation, you're safe to make errors, but the point is not the error is the problem. First of all, you have to catch the error, and then create the learning from the error. This is what you should actually aim for and go for. How do you do this? And very briefly, there are a number of elements that you have to have in place to have that working. First of all, you have to make sure that the authority gradient within a team, within an organization, should not be too steep. If it's too steep, you will not have flow of information. If it's very flat, that's very good for flow of information, but might be very bad for decision making. So sometimes you need hierarchies, and that's what I'm always saying. In a cockpit, you will always have a hierarchy. There will never be a situation where you have a democratic system, and then if you have an engine fire and then debate, well, should we do this, should we do that? You have somebody who's ultimately taking decisions. But still, you need information flowing. What we found when doing research with pilots, actually, a very interesting observation, I'm only touching it very briefly here, is that the most effective captains are not the most experienced ones, nor the ones who throw out commands in emergency situations immediately, but the ones who ask questions. We're leading by question, which is, for managers, something that is rather odd because they're used to giving commands to lead. They think they're expected to lead, to give directions to others. Actually, when you look at the research, at least in the cockpit, you see asking questions makes you a much better leader because you get more information. Next thing, that's a little bit linked to this status question and hierarchy question. There was a survey that was handed out in 2000, so it's not very recent, but it's still, I think, very representative for the situation that we face today. You have a statement, a junior team member should not question the decision by a senior team member. And the question was asked, do you agree with that statement or do you disagree? And we have three professional groups here who would give the responses. And do you have an idea which the first group is? A professional group, medicine. And can you be a bit more specific? Yeah, and which one? a group of professions. Surgeons. That's the surgeons. The surgeons say, we don't like that others question our decisions. We're the most experienced guys. Is that good? Well, they may be experienced, but they still could do errors. The next group is very closely associated with the first one. Any idea which this group is? Sorry? Yeah, exactly. So it's the ones in status, they're below the surgeons, but I mean they are also highly trained physicians. They are well trained individuals, and still they are not on the same level as surgeons, and they have a very different perspective than the surgeons. They see that the surgeons sometimes make mistakes, and they know it's better for them to correct. Still, it was surprising for me to see that there was still a group of 15% who would say, well, we should rather not interfere. In terms of harmony in the team or so, it might be good, but from a patient's perspective, I think this is not the optimal situation. Any idea what the last group is? It's not connected to the first two? Yeah, it's obviously, I mean, that's why I'm here. It's the pilots. For pilots, it's almost any pilot would say, this is nonsense. If a junior team member has information that helps me as a pilot, I'd like to have that information. It would be dumb if I would say otherwise. I need the information. So you have to think about create an environment where it's easy for other people to contradict your statements. Next thing that you have to be concerned is communication. Well, there's some theory, again, how you should communicate and so on. But then there is one thing that you could keep in mind is that communication is not always following the pattern that you intend to, because the mental model of the sender is not the same one as the receiver. And you have to think about this. Yeah? And in a lot of cases, you have not a communication taking place in a direct way, but in a rather indirect way. The one I mentioned with the case study, you're not talking about the real concern, but you're talking indirectly. You're using, either you're trying to focus on an issue that's connected, but it's not the real problem, or you're talking to another person, hoping that because you talk to C, A understands the message that you are discussing with C. Yeah? So you're not criticizing your boss, but you're talking to another guy and hope the boss hears and then takes the right conclusion. This way of communication is called hint and hope, which is not the most efficient way, but this is what you often see in hierarchies, and you should be very aware of this kind of communication behavior. Then we have situational awareness. You have to make sure that you understand the environment you're operating in. Again, there are certain theoretical aspects. What we often find is we're in complete agreement with each other within a team, especially if we're working with a team closely connected to us, same background, homogeneous teams fall into this trap very often. But it may not be the situation that is the one you perceive. And the best thing is to have somebody challenge you on this. There's a nice example. I don't think we have that much time, so I'll go over that very briefly. There was one case where we had a crew who were confronted with a critical situation. One engine is violently vibrating. What did they do? As pilots do, they checked for the engine instruments, and they figured out it was not engine number 2, but engine number 1. And immediately took action without further looking maybe for second, third kind of indications, rather jumping to this conclusion, shut down engine number 1. Unfortunately, this was the good engine, and what resulted was the airplane crashed, and what was really tragic, it crashed very shortly before the runway. If they would have a little bit more engine power, they would have survived and everything would have been fine. And by the way, flying with one engine is really not an emergency on a commercial airplane. Well then, very briefly, this is something what I always tell managers, that they basically know decision making up to this point. They look for facts, option, risk, benefits, decision, make a decision and then execute. What they are not really good at is C, is check. And this is something that pilots train and train and train. Check for facts, and if the facts don't align with what you expected when you made the decision, go through the model again and revisit your decision. Then, as a last element, think about where learning takes place. In Germany, we have the proverb, from mistakes you learn, aus Fehlern wird man klug. Reality shows that you're not becoming wise because of mistakes, only reflection helps you to take the learning. You have to think about why you did something wrong and how it happened. And only if you reflect, then you will have the learning take place. And the last thing that's important, if you have a learning, report it to others. This is one thing that was critically important in my example in the beginning from the Israeli Air Force. Make it known to others, report it to others, create an environment where it becomes natural that others see what errors have been made, so the organization can make the learning. It's not confined to the individuals who are there, and make it natural that people realize everybody makes mistakes. It's not just me who's sometimes wrong, but everybody can from time to time fall in the trap. So I'll try to show you these elements that in a way helped the aviation community become safer. I know it's pretty hard to implement it because it took aviation 10 years, and it's not only confined that they do training once in their lifetime, but because we all know training, the effects don't last over time. You have to do it again and again and again. This is why they go into simulators, why they train every 6 months. This concept, think about how they interact in a team, think about what they should do better over time. So for now, this thing has moved from the aviation into hospitals. So doctors are becoming better. It's not that they stay where they are. They are training now with pilots. They're trying to use checklists more in the operating room. They're thinking about the hierarchy that they have. And the same is happening, for example, in big institutions like banks, but also nuclear power stations and so on, and maybe also in software development. I hope I didn't scare you too much. If you're interested, there is a book that I've written that Andre briefly mentioned, and there are more funny examples from the aviation industry and what you can learn. And I hope I gave you a little bit insight. As I said, I hope I didn't concern you too much. And now wish you a nice and interesting conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Haig.